Now welcome to another Versus video, and no, this isn't the type of video where we pit two characters against each other in some type of death match to see which is the more powerful, though that can be fun. Instead, this will be a character comparison. We'll be looking at two former troopers in the Star Wars galaxy, Finn and Migs Mayfeld, and discussing how one scene, or the lack of a scene, can sometimes make or break a character, how in one case a rather generic concept and first appearance can end up becoming something great, while on the other hand a great concept and introduction can go so wrong, again all because of one scene. And so let's kick this off by taking a closer look at the original sort of concept for Migs Mayfeld by examining his introduction in Season 1 of The Mandalorian in the one and only episode he appears in during it, which is the 6th episode, or the one called The Prisoner. And throughout it, he's pretty much your standard or cookie-cutter mercenary type character, given a bit of flavor when we learn he used to be a sharpshooter for the Empire. He's a character that feigns some type of loyalty to those he works with, but we can see past it and know he's pretty much solely motivated by greed or money for the sake of being motivated by those things. He comes across as having, at best, a sketchy moral code, and there are hints here and there that he has done some pretty bad things in the past, which are all traits or the characterization given to him in order to give us the impression, or put the fear in us, the audience, that his selfish, unpredictable ways could easily lead to him turning on our hero to turn on Mando during the job, which is of course eventually what does happen when he and the others try to leave Mando behind, but in the end the tables get turned on him and he's the one who gets left behind and captured by the New Republic. And it's such a generic story and character in this episode, which doesn't automatically mean it's bad in either case, just that nothing here is all that original. Mayfeld in this episode is very similar to hundreds of other mercenary characters we've seen before, and so much so that your attitude towards him was probably far more swayed by what you think of the actor, Bill Burr, than anything the character actually does on screen. But at the very least, his character is consistent, if not overly intriguing, and does make sense and serves the story in a logical way. And the next time we see him, which we'll get to in a bit, the character will evolve instead of remaining this generic mercenary type character. But before getting to that, we now have to get to Finn and the start of his story, and unlike Mayfeld, who initially just fills in a generic role in one episode, Finn right out of the gate is meant to be a main character in the sequel trilogy. Which means he not only has to serve the greater story, of course, but in large part the story will feature or be about him, which means from this start we should expect better characterization to grab our attention, a better understanding of his motivations, and eventually some sort of story arc for him to follow. And at the very start, at the beginning of The Force Awakens, Finn, or FN-2187, is just another nameless, faceless stormtrooper like so many others we've seen before, which is actually what makes the thought or idea of exploring this character interesting, and the move to do so a seemingly bold one by the writers. Because in the films, at least, we've never really gone behind the helmet of the average soldier before, especially an enemy soldier. Usually in films like Star Wars, you don't want to humanize the, shall we say, cannon fodder. You don't want your audience to think about the fact that each and every stormtrooper killed by our heroes is actually a person with a life of their own, with hopes, fears, dreams, and so on, that may have found themselves in the service of the bad guys for any number of reasons. And so now with Finn, a main character in a trilogy no less, here's our chance to do that, to see a whole new and different perspective in Star Wars, to know what it's like to be a foot soldier for the bad guys who eventually goes to the other side. How will that change his attitude towards the enemy, towards, again, those bad guys, and especially towards the other foot soldiers who he knows are, or were, just like him. And Finn's start is a rather good one. At the beginning of The Force Awakens, we find him in his very first battle where he sees a fellow trooper die, and presumably a friend of his, and dies right in front of him, leaving a bloody handprint on his helmet, which essentially causes him to have something between a panic attack and, or perhaps based on the name of the film, an awakening of some kind. And this all feels pretty believable, that despite how much training you receive, you never know how you'll react till you face actual combat and until you face death. And clearly Finn wants no part of any of this. He doesn't want to kill anyone, even if it means his own survival is at stake, which gets established or reiterated shortly thereafter when he refuses to fire on the captured villagers. And he could have at least fired trying to intentionally miss them to potentially not raise suspicion. because he has to know his refusal to fire at all will be seen by the others and presumably by his superior officers like Captain Phasma, or reported to them, and that his weapon can be inspected to confirm he didn't fire and that nothing was wrong with it preventing him from firing, which will lead to him being reconditioned, and that's likely something like brainwashing. And all of this leads to pretty much the one and only sort of motivating factor for Finn early on in the story, which is fear. Fear of the First Order, the desire to just get away and escape and survive. And it's so strong that he will free Poe in order to help him escape the First Order. And he, of course, needs a pilot, that's why he does it. And up until this point, everything is good with the character. He is making sense and being overall pretty consistent. That is until the escape itself, where using a TIE fighter, he fires upon his fellow troopers to help secure his escape, which we could chalk up to fight, flight, or freeze all over again, right? The first time faced with a sort of life and death scenario when seeing his friend killed before, he froze up, he locked up. But this time he fights, even though what he's fighting against now are other troopers like the friend who died who triggered the change in him. Even still, it's certainly not impossible to believe he'd fire on them in the heat of the moment, especially since this is now his second time facing combat, facing a sort of life or death situation, and is less in shock overall. We could maybe even believe there wouldn't be a moment or slightest hint of hesitation out of him before firing on his fellow troopers too. It's also not impossible, I guess, to believe that in this moment he'd even sort of celebrate and cheer while killing his fellow troopers. Did you see that? But what is truly difficult to believe, especially considering how quickly we'll see him not only befriend Rey, but eventually risk his life for her and face this same fear, this First Order, implying a good degree of compassion in him, empathy and loyalty to those he will call friend, and that he tends to make friends pretty quickly if it only takes a few days to go and save Rey from the First Order. But anyway, what is truly difficult to believe is that there is never ever a moment where Finn is shown to be bothered by having to kill, again, his fellow troopers, who he knows are just like him, that they were all taken from birth and trained to do one thing. For some reason, no empathy for them. Even towards the end of the film, there is no hesitation about blowing up Starkiller Base and killing who knows how many of his fellow troopers. And so this bold choice by the writers to take us behind the helmet of a stormtrooper and humanize one of them, and thus potentially all of them, is nothing but a cosmetic choice. It's done more for the posters and advertising than any plan for an intriguing and impactful story with him. The stormtrooper background or origin means nothing to the character of Finn, so much so that he kills them without thought or a trace of remorse, and is quickly forgotten and abandoned along with his armor on the sand dunes of Jakku. It turns out it's little more than a convenient and lazy source of fear for him to quickly overcome and to make his decision to save Rey seem more heroic. And the real problem, what makes his story so hollow when it could have been something special, is his complete and utter lack of empathy towards his fellow stormtroopers, those who he spent his whole life with and thus would understand. It only reiterates that we, the audience, also shouldn't care about them, because one of their own sees them as nothing but fodder as well. Again, what seemed like it could be a bold choice for the story is a pointless one because they were unwilling to take his story the distance, to add a layer of conflict in Finn, a layer of complexity to him regarding the First Order or around his fellow troopers who, like him, were taken at a very young age and forced to serve it. And all it really would have taken is one scene immediately following the crash on Jakku, where he looks at his stormtrooper helmet, sees his reflection in the visor, and perhaps his hands begin to shake as he again realizes that there is a person under each and every one of those helmets, that he killed a bunch of people just like him, some that he no doubt personally knew and probably considered friend, and he did it all in order for him and him alone to escape. And this here could have been when the idea came to him or a promise is made that he would never again harm a fellow trooper, that he would never kill a fellow trooper if he can help it. And his role in this trilogy could have been radically different and would have fit in perfectly with him becoming a Jedi, someone who only kills as a last resort. His story could have been all about trying to liberate the people who were just like him, that he had killed trying to escape. Rey's place in the story or role in the story too could have been changed by this. She could have been the more reluctant hero, the one after living alone most of her life on a harsh desert planet and needing to be selfish, never having worked with or having to care about others. She's the one initially ruled more so by fear, and will have trouble finding and believing and fighting for a cause that is not all about herself, thus giving her something to truly overcome in the trilogy. But I digress, and let's move on and quickly talk about how you take a generic character with generic characterization and only a hint of a background, and do something fantastic with him, all in the span of about 2 minutes of screen time, which was in the Season 2 episode of The Mandalorian called The Believer, our second episode with Migs Mayfeld, where, after being freed from a prison essentially, where he ended up after the events of that previous episode we talked about, he's basically bribed into helping Mando locate Moff Gideon's Star Destroyer so that Grogu can hopefully be rescued. And at first he feels about the same as before, that he's the same character, that he's only doing it to get something out of it for himself, that is, until he encounters a former superior officer of his. And while we're discussing this scene for comparison, let's not forget how Finn acted when he met his former superior officer and how they did basically nothing with that moment, other than try to play it as a quick joke.
Remember me?
FN2187.
Not anymore. That name's Finn, and I'm in charge. I'm in charge now, Phasma. I'm in charge.
Anyway, whereas Finn's stormtrooper history more or less gets discarded with his armor and is a pretty irrelevant part of his character going forward until a weak effort to do something with it in The Rise of Skywalker, Mayfeld's past as a trooper is something that he can clearly never rid himself of, something that haunts him and likely is almost certainly the reason for his selfish nature, because of his inability to trust others, especially leadership or authority, and a fear to form attachments to others, which is all brought on by, in his past, a superior officer or officers treating him and the life of his fellow troopers, and pretty much everyone else, as a tool for some sort of greater good that doesn't actually benefit the people dying for it. Thus why his own needs, his own good, outweighs all else in his mind, or appears to. And we don't need to know the details, you don't need to know what Operation Cinder was, or what exactly the Battle of Burnin Khan was all about, which gets referenced in this scene. We only need to know that many people, including a lot of fellow troopers of Mayfeld, died pretty much for nothing. Couple that with some terrific acting from Bill Burr, and the fact that the memory of it all overcomes him so much in the moment that he shoots the officer dead in the middle of an Imperial compound, risking not only the mission but his life. It tells us just how horrific these events were, tells us that again Mayfeld is defined today in this moment by his past as a trooper for the Empire. And that, unlike Finn, who ultimately gives us the impression or reiterates it that stormtroopers are just cannon fodder not worth thinking about, instead here they feel like something much more than that, that they too are or can be looked at as victims of the Empire, that as Mayfeld mentions, they also had families. In these 2 minutes of screen time, we had a better glimpse behind the helmet than 3 movies could pull off with Finn, and we begin to care about a character not because we're told he's a main character and we're supposed to like him, but because, though he started out as someone maybe we didn't like, we can now feel for him and understand why he has become this way. This is then all capped off beautifully by him handing a helmet back to Mando, telling him he never saw his face, letting his friend know that he not only respects his way, despite mocking it in that episode in the first season, but he has no intention on ever trying to betray him. It lets us know that perhaps Mayfeld does still care about something beyond the self, that a part of whoever he once was, the person who cared about his fellow troopers, still exists and could be returning to some degree here. And all in all here, one scene has created a character we actually want to see again, that we want to learn more about, and that we want to cheer for, despite, again, that initial generic beginning and kind of being a bad guy at the start. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about these two characters. How were they handled? Could they be handled better, or what? Whatever the case may be, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.